Isabel Allende, House of the Spirits, Part 10. She was a block of solid flesh, a monstrous pyramid of fat and rags that came to a point in a tiny bald head with a pair of eyes that were sweet, blue, innocent, and surprisingly alive. Arthritis had transformed her into a monolithic being. She could no longer bend any of her joints or turn her head. Her fingers were clawed like the feet of a fossil, and in order to sit up in bed, she had to be supported by a pillow at her back, held in place by a wooden beam that, in turn, was propped against the wall. The passage of time could be read by the marks the beam had cut into the plaster, a path of suffering, a trail of pain. "Mama," Esteban murmured, and his voice broke in his chest, exploding into a contained sobbing that erased in a single stroke his sad memories, the rancid smells, frozen mornings, and greasy soup of his impoverished childhood, his invalid mother, an absent father, and the rage that had been gnawing at him ever since the day he first learned how to think, so that he forgot everything except those rare luminous moments in which this unknown woman would lay before him in her bed and rocked him in her arms, felt his forehead for fever, sung him lullabies, bent over to read the pages of a favorite book with him, had wept with grief to see him leave for work so early in the morning when he was still a boy, wept with joy when he'd returned at night, had wept, "Mother, for me." Doña Esther reached out her hand, but not in greeting. Their gesture was intended to hold him back. "Don't come any closer, son," she said, and her voice was still intact, just as he remembered it, the healthy, song-like voice of a young girl. "It's because of the smell," Ferrula said brusquely. "It clings." Esteban pulled back the threadbare damask quilt and saw his mother's legs. They were two bruised, elephantine columns covered with open wounds in which the larvae of flies and worms had made their nests and were busy tunneling, two legs rotting alive, with two outsized pale blue feet with no nails on the toes, full to bursting with the pus, the black blood, and the abominable animals that were feeding on her flesh. "Mother, in God's name, of my own flesh." "The doctor wants to amputate them, darling," Doña Esther said in her calm little girl voice. "But I'm too old for that. I'm tired of suffering. It's time for me to die. But I don't want to die without seeing you again, because after all these years I began to think that you were dead, and that perhaps your sister was writing you your letters to spare me the additional pain. Come into the light, son, so I can get a good look at you. My God, you look like a savage." "It's country life, Mama," he murmured. "Finally, you still look strong. How old are you now?" 35. "A good age to get married and settle down so I can die in peace." "You're not going to die, Mama," Esteban begged. "I want to know that all have grandchildren, someone to carry on your name with our blood in his veins." Ferrula's given up all hope of marrying. "But you must find yourself a wife, a decent Christian woman. But first you'd better cut your hair and shave your head. Do you hear me?" Esteban nodded. He knelt beside his mother and buried his face in her swollen hand, but the stench threw him back. Ferrula took him by the arm and led him out of that afflicted room. Once outside, he inhaled deeply, the smell still clinging to his nostrils, and it was then he felt the rage he knew so well, that rose to his nose like a blazing wave, injecting his eyes and bringing a pirate's curses to his lips. Rage at all the time he had gone without thinking of his mother, rage at having let her go uncared for, at not having loved her and cared for her enough, at being a miserable son of a bitch. "No, forgive me, Mother, that's not what I meant to say. Jesus, she's dying, she's an old woman, and I can't do a damned thing, not even erase her pain, alleviate the decay, get rid of that terrifying stench, that death soup in which you were boiling alive, Mother." 2 days later, Doña Esther Trueba died in the bed of pain where she had spent the final years of her life. She was alone because her daughter Ferrula had gone as she did every Friday to the tenements in the Misericordia district to say the rosary for the poor, the atheists, the prostitutes, and the orphans. who threw garbage at her, dumped chamber pots onto her, and spat on her while she, kneeling in the desolate slum alleyway, shouted an unbroken litany of Our Fathers and Hail Marys as she dripped with the slop of the poor, the spit of atheists, the garbage of prostitutes, and the refuse of orphans, weeping her lament of humiliation, begging forgiveness for those who know not what they do, and feeling that her bones were turning to rubber, her legs to cotton, and that a summer heat was pressing sin between her legs. Take from me this chalice, Lord, that her groin was bursting into hellfire. Flames of fear, of holiness. Our Father, don't let me fall into temptation, Jesus. Esteban was not with Doña Esther either when she died quietly in her bed of pain. He had gone to see the Del Valle family to inquire if they might still have an unmarried daughter, because after so many years of absence and barbarism, he knew of nowhere else to go to begin to keep his promise to his mother of giving her legitimate grandchildren, and he concluded that if Severo and Nevia had accepted him as a prospective son-in-law back in the days of Rosa the Beautiful, there was no reason they should refuse him, especially now that he was a rich man and no longer needed to scrape the earth for gold, and had everything he needed on deposit at the bank. That night, Esteban and Ferrula found their mother dead in bed. She was smiling peacefully as if at the last moment of her life her illness had wished her to spare her its familiar torture. The day Esteban Trueba asked to be received, Severo and Nevia de Valle remembered the words with which Clara had broken her lengthy silence. They were not the least surprised when their visitor asked if they had any daughters of marriageable age and condition. They tallied things up, telling him that Ana had become a nun, Teresa was very ill, and all the others were already married, except for Clara, the youngest, who was still available, although she was a rather eccentric creature, not particularly well suited to the duties of marriage and domestic life. With all due honesty, they told him of their daughter's traits without omitting the fact that she had spent more than a half her lifetime without speaking because she did not feel like it, and not because she was unable to, as the Romanian Rostipov had made quite clear, as Dr. Cuevas had confirmed after innumerable examinations. But Esteban Trueba was not the kind of man to let himself be scared away by tales of ghosts in hallways, objects that move of their own accord, or prognostications of bad luck, much less by Clara's prolonged silence, which he considered a virtue. He concluded that none of these things posed an obstacle to bringing healthy, legitimate children into the world, and he asked to be introduced to Clara. Nivea went out to fetch her daughter, and the two men were left alone in the drawing room, an occasion that Trueba, with characteristic candor, took advantage of to present his economic position. Please, Esteban, one thing at a time, Severo interrupted him. First you have to see the girl and get to know her a little, and then we also have to consider Clara's wishes. Don't you think so? Nevia returned with Clara. The young girl entered the room with blazing cheeks and blackened nails. She had been outside helping the gardener plant dahlia bulbs, and just this once her clairvoyant faculties had failed her, leaving her unprepared to meet her visitor in more suitable attire. When he saw her, Esteban jumped to his feet in astonishment. He recalled her as a thin, asthmatic child with little grace, but the young woman who stood before him that was a delicate ivory medallion, with a sweet face and a mane of chestnut hair whose curls spilled from her coiffure, melancholy eyes that gave her a sparkling, half-mocking look when she laughed, her frank, open laugh, her head gently thrown back. She greeted him with a strong handshake that showed no trace of shyness. I was expecting you, she said simply. They spent a few hours in this formal visit, speaking of the opera season, trips to Europe, the political situation, and the winter chills, while they drank sweet wine and ate puff pastries. Esteban watched Clara with all the discretion he could muster, feeling himself gradually coming under the young girl's spell. He could not recall being this interested in anyone since the glorious day when he had first set eyes on Rosa the Beautiful, buying licorice in the pastry shop in the Plaza de Armas. He compared the two sisters in his mind and concluded that Clara had the advantage when it came to charm, although there was no doubt that Rosa had been far more beautiful. Night fell, and two maids came in to draw the curtains and light the lamps. Esteban realized that his visit had gone on too long. His manners left a great deal to be desired. He said a stiff good night to Severo and Navia and asked permission to visit Clara again. "I hope I don't bore you, Clara," he said, blushing. "I'm a simple country man, and I'm at least 15 years older than you. I don't know how to act with a young girl like yourself." "Don't you want to marry me?" Clara asked as he noticed an ironic gleam in her eyes. "My God, Clara!" exclaimed her mother, horrified. "Forgive her, Esteban. The child's always been impertinent." "I want to know, Mama. I don't want to waste my time," Clara said. "I also like things to be direct." Esteban smiled happily. "Yes, Clara, that's why I came." Clara took him by the arm and accompanied him to the gate. In the final glance they exchanged, Esteban understood that she had accepted him. He was overcome with happiness. As he got into his carriage, he was smiling, unable to believe his good fortune and not understanding how such a charming girl as Clara could have accepted his proposal without even being acquainted with him. He did not know that she had seen her own destiny, that she had summoned him with the power of her thought, and that she had already made up her mind to marry without love. Out of respect for Esteban Trueba's mourning, they waited a few months, during which he courted Clara the old-fashioned way, just as he had done with her sister Rosa, without knowing that Clara hated licorice and aristocrats made her laugh. At the end of the year, around Christmas time, they officially announced their engagement in the newspaper and exchanged rings in the presence of their closest friends, more than 100 altogether, at a Pantagruelian banquet that was an endless parade of stuffed turkey, sugar-cured pork, freshwater eel, lobster au gratin, raw oysters, the Carmelite nuns, special orange and lemon pies, the Dominicans' walnut and almond torts, the Clarissas' chocolate and cream cakes, and cases of French champagne that were brought courtesy of the consul, who took advantage of his diplomatic privileges to traffic in contraband. All was served and presented with the utmost simplicity by the old servants of the house, who wore their everyday black aprons to give the celebration the appearance of a simple family gathering, because any display of extravagance was a sign of vulgarity that would be condemned as a sin of vanity and bad taste, according to the austere and somewhat lugubrious ancestry of that society, descended from hard-working Basque and Spanish immigrants. Clara was a vision in white chantilly lace and natural camellias, as happy as a parrot after her 9 years of silence, dancing with her fiancé beneath the canopies and lanterns, completely oblivious to the warnings of the spirits that gestured desperately at her from the curtains, because in the tumult and whirl she could not see them. The ceremony of the rings had remained unchanged since colonial times. At 10 o'clock at night, one of the men servants circulated among the guests, ringing a tiny glass bell. The music stopped, and the guests gathered in the main hall, where a small innocent priest, adorned with the vestments of high mass, read the complicated sermon he had written, exalting confused and impractical virtues. Clara did not listen to him, because when the din of the music died down and the whirl of the dancers had subsided, she began to pay attention to the whispering spirits behind the curtains, as she realized that it had been hours since she had last seen Barbaras. She looked everywhere for him, summoning all her senses, but her mother's elbow in her ribs brought her back to the pressing matter of the ceremony. The priest finished his speech and blessed the 2 gold rings. Esteban quickly put one on his bride-to-be and slipped the other on his own finger. At the moment, a scream of horror shook the guests. The crowd cleared to either side, making a path for Barbaras, who staggered out blacker and larger than ever, with a butcher's knife stuck in his back to the hilt, bleeding to death like an ox, his long colt legs trembling, his muzzle dripping with threads of blood, his eyes clouded in agony. Dragging one paw after the other, he traced the zigzag path of a wounded dinosaur. Clara fell back onto the French silk love seat. The enormous dog approached her, laid his huge millennial animal head on her lap, and looked up at her with lovesick eyes, and gradually dimmed grew blind, while the white chantilly lace, the French silk of the sofa, the Persian carpet, and the parquet floor absorbed his blood. Barbaros was dying without any hurry, his eyes riveted on Clara, who stroked his ears and murmured words of comfort until finally, with a single rattle, the dog fell rigid at her feet. Suddenly it was as if they had all been awakened from a nightmare, and the sounds of panic spread throughout the room. The guests hurriedly said goodbye, stepping over the pools of blood and quickly gathering up their fur stoles, their top hats, their canes, their umbrellas, and their beaded evening hats. The only ones left in the parlor were Clara, with the animal on her lap, her parents, who were locked in terrified embrace at the thought of such an evil omen, and her fiancé, who could not comprehend such an uproar over a dead dog, but when he realized that Clara was transfixed, he picked her up in his arms and carried her half-conscious to her room, where Nana's ministrations and Dr. Hueva's pills prevented her from falling back into her stupor and her muteness. Esteban Trueba asked the gardener to help him, and between the two of them they threw Barbara's body into the car. Death had made him so heavy that it was nearly impossible to lift him. The following year was spent preparing for the wedding. Nivea took charge of Clara's trousseau, since Clara did not show the slightest interest in the contents of the sandalwood trunks, and continued her experiments with the three-legged table and her defining cards. The sheets so carefully embroidered, the linen tablecloth, and the underwear the nuns had sewn 10 years ago for Rosa, with the intertwined initials of Trueba and Del Valle, were now part of Clara's trousseau. Nivea ordered clothes from Buenos Aires, London, and Paris, travel dresses, country dresses, party dresses, stylish hats, matching shoes and purses of lizard and suede, and various assorted other things which remained in their tissue paper wrappings, preserved with lavender and camphor, without the young brides ever giving them so much as one distracted look. Esteban Trueba took charge of a team of bricklayers, carpenters, and plumbers who were engaged to construct the largest, sunniest, and sturdiest house imaginable, built to last 1,000 years and lodge several generations of a beautiful, bountiful family of legitimate Truebas. He hired a French architect and had part of the building materials imported from abroad, so that his would be the only house with German-stained glass windows, moldings carved in Austria, faucets of English bronze, Italian marble floors, and special locks ordered by catalog from the United States, which arrived with the wrong instructions and no keys. Barola, horrified by the expense, tried to keep him from additional folly, from buying French furniture, teardrop chandeliers, and Turkish carpets, by arguing that this would quickly be their ruin and that they would find themselves repeating the story of the extravagant Trueba who had sired them. But Esteban countered that he was rich enough to give himself these luxuries, and threatened to line the doors with silver if she went on bothering him. She replied that such wastefulness was certainly a mortal sin, and that God would punish all of them for spending on nouveau riche vulgarities, that what they should be giving to the poor. Despite the fact that Esteban Trueba was no great lover of innovation, and had in fact a deep mistrust of the dislocations of modernity, He decided that his house should be constructed like the new palaces of North America and Europe, with all the comforts but retaining a classical style. He wanted it to be as far removed as possible from the native architecture. He would hear nothing of 3 courtyards, corridors, rusty fountains, dark rooms, walls of whitewashed adobe, or dusty tiles on the roof. He wanted 2 or 3 heroic floors, rows of white columns, and a majestic staircase that would make a half-turn on itself and wind up in a hall of white marble, enormous, well-lit windows, and the overall appearance of order and peace, beauty and civilization. That was typical of foreign peoples and would be in tune with his new life. His house would be the reflection of himself, his family, and the prestige he planned to give the surname that his father had stained. He wanted the splendor to be visible from the street, and so he designed a French garden with topiaries fit for Versailles, deep wells of flowers, a smooth and perfect lawn, jets of water, and several statues of the gods of Olympus, and perhaps 1 or 2 courageous Indians from the history of the Americas, naked and crowned with feathers, his one concession to patriotism. He could hardly guess that solemn, cubic, dense, pompous house, which sat like a hat amid its green and geometric surroundings, would end up full of protuberances and incrustations, of twisted staircases that led to empty spaces, of turrets, of small windows that could not be opened, doors hanging in mid-air, crooked hallways and portholes that linked the living quarters so that people could communicate during the siesta, all of which were Clara's inspiration. Every time a new guest arrived, she would have another room built in another part of the house, and if the spirits told her that there was a hidden treasure or an unburied body in the foundation, she would have a wall knocked down until the mansion was transformed into an enchanted labyrinth that was impossible to clean and that defied any number of state and city laws. But when Treba built the house that everybody called the big house on the corner, it bore the stately seal with which he managed to stamp everything around him, as if in memory of his childhood privations. Clara never went to see the house during the time it was being built. She was as uninterested in it as she was in her trousseau, and she left all decisions in the hands of her fiancé and her future sister-in-law. When her mother died, Firula found herself alone and with no usual purpose in her life, at an age when she could no longer hope to marry. For a time, she made daily visits to the slums as part of a frenzied charitable activity, which gave her chronic bronchitis and brought no peace to her tormented soul. Esteban wanted her to take a trip, buy herself some clothes, and enjoy herself for the first time in her melancholy life, but she already had the habit of austerity and had spent too much time cooped up in her house. She was afraid of everything. Her brother's marriage plunged her into uncertainty, because she feared that this would be yet another reason for Esteban to keep his distance, and he was her only comfort and support. She was afraid of ending her days crocheting in some nursing home for spinsters from good families. Thus she was overjoyed to learn that Clara was incompetent when it came to the simplest domestic tasks, and that whenever she had to make a decision, she became distracted and vague. "She's a bit on the stupid side," Firula concluded with delight.